Movement into and out of cells. There are three main ways that molecules and ions can move into and out of cells. Diffusion. Diffusion happens when substances are more concentrated in one place than another. The difference in concentration is called a concentration gradient. So in the diagram you can see a concentration gradient because the left side contains more particles than the right side. And also according to the particle theory, we know liquid and gas particles can move about due to their kinetic energy. So some particles move from high to low concentration at the same time. Some particles are moving from low to high concentration. But in this situation, always there are more particles move from the region of higher concentration to lower concentration than in the opposite side. We say there is a net movement of molecules from higher concentration to lower concentration. So this happens until all the molecules are evenly distributed. Even after all the molecules are evenly distributed, molecules still move in either direction, but there is no net movement of molecules. When molecules move from high to low concentration, we say they move down a concentration gradient. The diffusion is defined as the net movement of particles from a region of higher concentration to a region of lower concentration down a concentration gradient as a result of their random movement. So diffusion does not need any energy, therefore it's a passive movement. The energy for diffusion comes from the kinetic energy of particles. Let's look at diffusion happening in living organisms. So we know so many chemical reactions are happening in cells. So cells need to obtain many of their requirements such as oxygen and nutrients through diffusion. At the same time, cells also get rid of many of their waste products such as carbon dioxide, lactic acid and urea through diffusion. These substances have to cross the cell membrane that is partially permeable. A partially permeable membrane allows only small molecules such as oxygen, carbon dioxide and water to pass through easily, but not large molecules. So the diagram shows diffusion of oxygen molecules into a cell. So first diagram shows more oxygen molecules outside. So then diffusion takes place from outside to inside. The second one shows after diffusion, the oxygen molecules are equally distributed. Examples for diffusion in living organisms. Let's see a few examples where diffusion happens in plants and animals. First one is the gas exchange in lungs. When we breathe in, alveoli are filled with air and this air contains more oxygen than the amount of oxygen in blood vessels. So oxygen molecules diffuse from air into the blood. On the other hand, blood contains more carbon dioxide than the amount of carbon dioxide in air. So carbon dioxide molecules diffuse from blood into the air. Second example is the absorption of nutrients by small intestines. After digestion of food, the small intestines contain more nutrient molecules such as glucose and amino acids. So these molecules move or diffuse into the small intestine, cells in the small intestine through diffusion. Third and fourth examples are from plants. Gas exchange in leaves through stomata. So for photosynthesis and respiration, oxygen and carbon dioxide gases have to go in and out of the leaf and this happens through stomata. So during daytime, more photosynthesis takes place than respiration. So carbon dioxide gas should diffuse into the leaves and also oxygen gas should diffuse out of the leaves. So this happens through stomata. And apart from these two gases, water molecules also diffuse out of the leaves to the air through stomata, which is called transpiration. Factors that affect diffusion. We are going to discuss 4 factors that affect the rate of diffusion, and the first one is concentration gradient. Diffusion happens more quickly when there is a steep concentration gradient, which means there is a big difference in concentrations between the two areas. When molecules move into the cell, most of these molecules are used up by the cell for different reactions. For example, oxygen molecules and glucose molecules are used in aerobic respiration. Therefore, these molecules always have a low concentration inside the cytoplasm than that of outside. Therefore, the concentration gradient is maintained and diffusion can happen. Diffusion keep on happening into the cell. The second factor that affects the rate of diffusion is the distance that the molecules have to travel. The shorter the distance, the higher the rate of diffusion. When the distance is more, diffusion is usually slow. The example that we can use is again the gas exchange happening in lungs. You can see both the alveolus and the capillary are having a very thin wall. Their thickness is just one cell. Both of these structures have just one cell thickness, which means the distance for diffusion is less. Therefore, the diffusion can happen faster. The third factor is surface area. When the surface area is greater, the rate of diffusion is high. In some cells, cell membranes are folded to give large surface area to allow many molecules to cross by diffusion. So again, we can identify 3 examples where the surface area is increased. First one is the surface area in intestinal wall. So the small intestine is the place where the digested nutrients are absorbed. So the small intestine is always having a larger surface area by having folds as well as villi and microvilli. All these 3 structures increase the surface area so that the diffusion of nutrients happen very fast. The second example is the absorption of water and minerals through root hair cells. So root hair cells have long and thin extensions which increase their surface area. Therefore, the diffusion of these molecules can take place faster. The third example is again in lungs. So the surface area of the lung is greatly increased by the presence of alveoli, which helps us to absorb oxygen and also to release carbon dioxide very fast. Without the presence of alveoli, the surface area of the lungs would be very much lesser, so diffusion would be very slow. The last factor that affects the rate of diffusion is temperature. The higher the temperature, the higher the rate of diffusion. So, according to the particle theory, when the temperature rises, molecules get more kinetic energy and they can move faster. So, you can see the diagrammatic representation. When the temperature is low, the molecules are moving slowly, which is represented by shorter lines. And when the temperature is high, the molecules can move faster, which is shown in a longer line. So, what we have to understand, when the temperature is high, diffusion is happening faster. Osmosis is the second method where molecules move into and out of cells. Osmosis is a special type of diffusion. It is the diffusion of the water molecules through the partially permeable cell membrane. So in osmosis, there should be a partially permeable membrane and only the movement of water molecules are considered. So cytoplasm is a solution of proteins and other dissolved substances in water. Cytoplasm contains a large amount of water. So sometimes water moves into the cell, sometimes water moves out of the cell. Animal cells are always surrounded by the tissue fluid which also contains water. When it comes to plants, the soil contains water, so the roots are surrounded by a thin film of water. Let's look at this example to understand more about osmosis. Side A and side B are separated by a partially permeable membrane, which is also called a whisking tubing or dialysis tubing when it comes to the laboratory experiments. The holes in the partially permeable membrane allow only small water molecules to pass through, but not large sugar molecules. Side A contains a dilute sugar solution where there are more water molecules and less sugar molecules. So we say A has a higher water potential. Side B is a concentrated sugar solution which has less water molecules and more sugar molecules. So when it comes to water potential, side B has a low water potential. So there is a concentration gradient for water molecules. Side A has more water molecules than side B. So water molecules diffuse down this concentration gradient from high water potential to low water potential. So osmosis can be defined as the net movement of water molecules from a region of higher water potential to a region of low water potential through a partially permeable membrane. The third method where molecules move into and out of cells is active transport. At times, cells need to take in substances which are only present in small quantities around them. So diffusion does not support this method because the molecules have to move against the concentration gradient. One example is root hair cells have to take in nitrate ions from soil. So the concentration of nitrate ions inside the root hair cell is higher than the concentration of nitrate ions in the soil. So the intake of nitrate ions is against the concentration gradient, and this happens by a process called active transport. Active transport needs energy which should come from respiration of the cell. Active transport is aided by special transport proteins called carrier proteins present in cell membrane. These proteins pick up molecules from outside the cell and then change the shape in such a way that they push the molecules through the cell membrane into the cytoplasm of the cell. Energy is needed to produce the shape change in the transport proteins. The definition for active transport comes as the movement of molecules and ions in or out of a cell through the cell membrane against a concentration gradient using energy from respiration. Examples are absorption of nitrate ions by root hair cells, uptake of glucose by epithelial cells in the small intestine, and in kidney, absorption of glucose out of the tubule and into the blood. Let's look at a comparison between diffusion, osmosis, and active transport. The substances diffuse into and out of cells are usually water molecules, glucose, oxygen, carbon dioxide, and urea. But in osmosis, it's only water molecules. In active transport, it could be mineral ions. The movement of substances in diffusion is always down the concentration gradient, and in osmosis also down the concentration gradient. But in active transport, the movement of substances is against the concentration gradient. Occurs across the cell membrane. In diffusion, there is no need for a presence of cell membrane. But in osmosis, there should be a partially permeable membrane, which is a cell membrane in living organisms. In active transport also, cell membrane is necessary because the carrier proteins are always present in the cell membrane. Energy requirement for diffusion is no, and osmosis also no. So both diffusion and osmosis are passive movements, but active transport needs energy from respiration.